on, everybody? Just about 12 hours until the Open Championship, so excitement is in the air. Going to be hard to sleep this afternoon, but in this video, guys, going to go over our fades and sleepers for this week. Some of them are overhyped and underhyped players for these GPP contests, and I think, of course, with the fades that you should be avoiding. And then on the sleepers, I think they're going to be high upside plays that not many people are getting to that perhaps can get you some leverage in those contests. So, and that's what we're looking at for this video. And of course, since it's here on Wednesday and we're getting pretty close to lock, we do have a solid idea on ownership and we can start to make some of these game theory type decisions. So when it comes to the fades, they will be a little bit higher owned than I expect them to be. And of course, the sleeper picks are guys that are a little bit lower owned than I think they should be at this point. So with that being said, now that we're all on the same page, let's go ahead and hop right on in. Alrighty, because it's a major championship, we're going to do 4 fades and 4 sleepers this time. So bear with me if it seems like we're going faster this time, but just more information to cover. So at the top of things, we're going to start with the fades, and the first one I've got for you is going to be Jon Rahm at $10,800. Now, you can't play everybody up top, right? There's going to be a ton of really solid options. So it's not like Jon Rahm's coming in with bad form, somebody who couldn't win this event. I'm sure he could go out there, win this by 4 to 5 strokes. But when I have options up there that are just all so tempting, I have to go out there and exclude some guys from my pool. And Jon Rahm goes to the top of that list. The main reason here is due to his links play record. So if you look at a lot of his results on links courses, it's been okay. He has a few top 10s at the Open Championships, but outside of that, he's also struggled, particularly at some of the American setups. Like last week at the Scottish, really struggled over the weekend for the Pebble Beach course, also for Kiawah Island. Didn't play his best brand of golf. Now, they weren't horrible performances, right? You're still looking at top 10s in some of those events, but he hasn't gone out there and put up a winning track record like what we've seen on a lot of other type of venues. The other reason that I'm fading Jon Rahm here is that he's not royally underowned. I mean, of the guys priced above $10,000, I believe he's the 3rd lowest owned. So there's 2 guys that are even lower owned than Jon Rahm. So you'd expect, with how much he struggled last week with his record on these link style setups, that maybe he'd be a little bit overlooked, but to this point, it would not surprise me to see him right around 13 to 14% ownership. You can say I have him at 11% as of right now, but given, especially in like a large contest where a lot of casuals are playing, a lot of people are going to go to that name recognition, somebody like Jon Rahm, who's a top 3 player in the world. So for me, he's going to be a spot that I'm staying away from. Just guys that have a little bit of a better track record on link style setups, but on top of that, just a better mindset for these golf courses. I mean, it's well documented that Jon Rahm can get a little bit in his own head from time to time, and it would not surprise me if a bad bounce from time to time around St. Andrews gets in his head, right? Kind of throws him off a little bit, perhaps isn't able to putt nearly as effectively as he is with a clear mind. So for me, I'm looking to some of the more steady approaches up top. Next up, we've got Xander Schauffele, who is the highest owned player on the slate. So 22.7% ownership on him. And for me, that's really the whole idea here, right? This is a game theory type of video. If you're looking to just play the chalk, then by all means, right? Go out there, play the top 4 owned players, right? You're going to have a really hard time at winning those contests. If you're playing in cash, I implore you, right? Go out there, play Xander. There's a reason why he's the highest owned player. But when we're looking to take down a 100,000 plus entry contest, you really have to be thinking on your toes. And if you're going to take chalk, which there are a few pieces of chalk I am certainly eating this week, I don't want to make it out to be like I'm fading all of the chalk here. But Xander Schauffele at nearly 25%. Is a spot that I just have to stay away from. You can't play all of the chalk on a slate and get adequate leverage. And at $9,900, that $100 difference between $9,900 and $10,000 with the Jordan Spieth is going to pay a huge difference on his ownership. I mean, realistically, if he was $10,000, he might be like 18% projected owned right now, rather than the 23 to 25% I think he comes in at. It's crazy how, you know, it's like with gas prices, right? They put that little 9 out of 10s on the end there to try and play a little bit of a psychological trick on you. So with Xander Schauffele, somebody that I'm going to be staying away from, mostly due to the ownership. But on top of that, in the wedge ranges, he's only solid in one of the 4 that I'm looking at. I believe it was the 75 to 100 category, which will be overutilized this week. But a lot of those, you know, feel wedge ranges, you know, he was in like the top 20 to top 25. Whereas a lot of these guys up top, especially like a Jordan Spieth or a Justin Thomas, rank in the top 10 of almost every category. So I'd rather pivot to those players, particularly if they're going to be significantly lower owned than somebody like Xander Schauffele. Next up, we've got Patrick Cantlay here at $9,400. And this, for really comes down to major championship pedigree. I mean, he just has not broken through at a major yet, and it's becoming more than a trend at this point. And realistically, I'd be okay with playing Cantlay if he was like 10% owned, if people were also fading him for that reason, but he's 14.5% owned. That is not low owned, it's certainly not high owned, but it's about average for this 9K range. And when there's options around him that are similar in terms of ownership, and at least in terms of my projections, what we've seen at major championships and even lead-in form have advantageous metrics, I'm going to be making those pivots almost every single time. So it's not like he's super chalk like somebody like a Xander. He's a little bit higher owned than Jon Rahm, obviously. It's just a case of opportunity cost. There are players in that 9K range that I would much rather get to, and the shots gained metrics aren't really bulletproof like what you'd see with Jon Rahm. Right? Jon Rahm, right, gaining across the board. Xander Schauffele, gaining across the board. It makes sense that people would want to get to them, right? I have Will Zalatoris on here rather than Patrick Cantlay. Oh yeah, sorry, because Willie Z's the sleeper pick. Sorry about that. But here with Patrick Cantlay, right? He's not gaining a ton around the green. The putter got back to a positive, but if you look at the last 50 measured rounds, you can see the struggles start to creep in, right? A little bit less significant with the putter. The approach play isn't all that great. In fact, he was losing with the approach play for quite some time. And if you compare it to the guys around him, right, it's like a stroke per round with Xander, right? There's a reason why people are getting to him. A stroke per round off the tee with somebody like a Jon Rahm. Those make a little bit more sense. Obviously, they're a little bit more expensive as a result. Patrick Cantlay's shots gained metrics have kind of been lagging behind for at least a few months now. And I know over the last 2 to 3 starts, they have improved. That's why over the last 24 rounds, they look as good as they do here. But just, he's not a slam dunk pick. And there are slam dunk picks around him, like a Willie Z, who we'll talk about here in a second, or even a few other guys like Cameron Smith. That is a core pick for me this week, making him a fade. And now lastly, the last fade we'll talk about here is going to be Tommy Fleetwood at $8,600. And for me, it's just ridiculous that he's 18.4% owned. Now, I thought he was going to be a little bit popular, maybe like 15% owned, a significant amount of people wanting to get to Tommy Fleetwood at least a little bit on this slate, but it seems like people are using him as a core pick. I mean, he's top 5 on the slate when it comes to ownership, and at $8,600, I get that he's a solid fit. He's also a solid price tag, but we're playing the ownership game. We're playing against 100,000 other entries, and if you're going to have to use 35% of your laps, potentially even 40% to get leverage on Tommy Fleetwood, I don't think that's something that I would encourage you to do in earnest. At least it's a lot of lineups. Tommy Fleetwood is extremely volatile. And even though the recent form has been there in patches, right, you can see the top 5 at the Scottish, top 5 at the PGA, that's what everyone's hunkering down on. Must be forget he missed the cut at the US Open, another major. Must be forget he just hardly top 50'd at the Travelers, or didn't crack the top 35 at the Charles Schwab or the Byron Nelson. So he's far from bulletproof. This is somebody who has shown a little bit of susceptibilities, we'll say, over the last few months here, and not somebody who's worth taking in like 40 to 50% of your lineups. Before we hop into the sleepers, just want to remind you, if you want access to all of my projections, so everyone in my player poll projected ownership for everyone in the field, access to my modeling, my Discord server, make sure to go ahead and check out my Patreon page. A link is down in the description of this video to that. It is $10 a month, and for that, you get access to my projections for every golf tournament. On top of 4-round stuff, I cover Showdown, Prize Picks, where I have spreadsheets with my hit rates for every single prop on the board. So if you're on Prize Picks, if you're playing Draftkings Golf, I would highly recommend you go ahead and check it out. Or if you're even just going for outright bets, a lot of my tools and analysis are extremely valuable for that as well. So certainly a great value there. That's how you go ahead and get all the data at your disposal. Alrighty, and now we move into the sleeper picks, which up top, our number 1 sleeper is going to be Will Zalatoris at $9,600. Now, Willie Z, I didn't think he'd be a sleeper, right? Going into the week, everyone likes playing Willie at major championships. He has proven to be an unbelievable asset when it comes to these majors. I mean, just putting up the best shots gained metrics of anybody in PGA Tour history to this point of his career. So really, I mean, that should kind of speak for itself. Why the hell was he 11.8% owned? I mean, realistically, I thought he'd be 25% owned. I thought that would make sense. And honestly, I was debating playing him at that ownership, right? I wasn't going to go 50%. I'd take 40%. I'd just take slight leverage to the field there. But if he's going to be 11.8% owned, I might still play 35 to 40%. But I might be trying to get a lot more leverage to the field because he's proven to this point where you got to have him in the optimal more often than not at these majors. And realistically, you could be 25% owned, and like I said, and I might still get to him. His shots gained metrics have kind of been through the roof, and that's despite not having the most consistent run of play. He's gaining across the board. The putter has become a major positive for Zalatoris, and particularly at major championships, where he's gone out there and from round to round been the best putter in the entire field. The recent form speaks for itself as well. I mean, miscut at the Scottish is hopefully why his ownership's lower. I think that's why a lot of people are avoiding him. Also with guys like Justin Thomas. That's also why guys like Xander Schauffele, for example, Patrick Cantlay, are getting a little bit more ownership. It's because of their performance last week, which, sure, it was the Scottish Open, but it's going to play completely different. I mean, that golf course was more of an American style of links. This week is a true link style setup. It's extremely firm, extremely fast. It's not really going to play comparably at all. So that last week's form, I don't know how much I'm really looking into it anymore, particularly with the reports we've gone from the grounds about how we expect the course to play. So if you look past that, second place finish at the US Open, great. Top 5 at the Memorial, which should be relatively comparable conditions. Second place at the PGA Championship. And sure, he has those missed cuts in there. He's a volatile player, but it's not like he's chalk, right? If he was 25% owned, I'd understand the argument to fade him, right? He goes out there and he flops from time to time. But if he's going to be 11.8% owned, it's just a great spot to target. So I'm glad that people seem to be a little bit worried about that miscut there. And if that's going to make him a relatively low-owned play in this range, because 11.8%, guys, I believe, I mean, of the guys $9,400 and above, I believe he's like the second or third lowest owned player, something like that. That's outrageous to me. Absolutely fire up Willie Z here. Next up, we've got Brooks Koepka, and you guys know, at major championships, I play Brooks Koepka. You're going to get the spiel every time we get to one, and of late, guys, it has not paid off, but if you look from the long-term sample size, it speaks for itself, and as soon as this, you know, I'm going to call it a slot machine ends up paying off, I mean, it's just going to get lower and lower ownership. I mean, a year ago, even when he was hurt, people were playing like 18% of Brooks at majors because everyone knew about that track record. And sure, again, for that last year, I think he's cracked the optimal at majors twice. One was at Kiowa Island, which we'll talk about here in a second, and I can't remember the other one off the top of my head. But he was up there in one of the majors, didn't win, right? It was like a top 10, top 15 finish. But at $8,500, he doesn't have to win this golf tournament, right? A top 5 finish would be more than enough for the optimal lineup. But also Kiowa Island, where he last year finished second place to Phil. That is becoming one of the bigger comps I'm using here because it was a link style setup. It was right along the ocean. Sure, it's an American designer. It was a Pete Dye design. It has a lot of the undulations that you're going to see at a St. Andrews. And frankly, Pete Dye was quoted as saying that St. Andrews was part of his inspiration. I mean, obviously, from the visual perspective, there are a lot of similarities between the golf courses. Now, from a strategy perspective, right, not shared greens, not massive greens like you have at both golf courses, but the same type of golf shots you had to hit on approach at Kiowa are the same type of shots they're going to have to hit this week, particularly over the weekend at Kiowa, where, I mean, there were guys landing the ball on fronts of greens, and sometimes they were bounding over the green. That's how firm and fast it was there, particularly for some of the shots that were downwind on going from like holes 5 through holes 12 there at Kiowa. We're all going downwind on Saturday and Sunday. It was impossible to hold greens, but Brooks was playing those shots short of the green, bouncing them up there to like 5 to 10 feet. That's why he almost won that golf tournament. So, you know, he's 7% owned. And again, last year when he did that, he was injured. He was like just after his surgery. He was still recovering. You have Brooks Koepka saying he's actually healthy at this point. And I know, right, the whole Live Tour thing. Is he actually trying? If there's any tournament that Brooks is actually going to ramp up for, per his words, it is these major championships. So the metrics aren't going to look good, right? He hasn't played that solid of golf for quite some time. Obviously, gaining off the tee, gaining with the putter. Even with this similar type of shots gain profile, went out there, won the waste management last year out of nowhere. He's just proven it time and time again that he's a winner, somebody that pops from time to time. And I usually take stabs on him at majors, right? You know, at the waste management, I was not on him, right? I did not expect that. He just randomly popped there. But at major championships, he has a much higher percentage chance of doing that just because he's mentally engaged. So that shouldn't be a surprise to anyone there, guys. I'm going to be at least 20, maybe 25% on Brooks this week. I'm hoping that slot machine finally ends up paying off. Next up, we've got Robert Mcintyre, who was another player who missed the cut last week there at the Scottish Open, which, of course, that was his home event. I'm sure that really wasn't something that sat very well with him in his stomach, but he's a world-class player, top 50 player in the world, and he's coming in at 3.2% ownership, which makes sense. He's a little bit overpriced, right? I mean, he's got Cam Young against him, you know, Max Homa, who's extremely chalky this week, but at the same time, Robert Mcintyre, he could very easily outpace these players. And if he's going to be 5 to 6 times less owned, sign me up 100 times out of 100, because you could take 10 to 15% of Robert McIntyre and have at least 3 to 5 times the field. And he certainly has a lot of upside here. Off the tee, he's a little bit inaccurate, but perhaps laying up off the tee because of the firm and fast conditions is advantageous for McIntyre. Great approach player, great putter. I mean, from fairway in is one of the best players on the PGA Tour. It's just off the tee, he can get into trouble from time to time. Not very that accurate, gets the yips off the tee from time to time, can miss left and right. And as long as he's not missing right on the back nine, should be in good shape. And there's a lot of room to the left there on the back nine. So if he just bails out, plays strategically, I really see this being a solid course for McIntyre. And being a lefty, you know, there's no way to know what'll be advantageous without knowing the wind conditions beforehand. But he's one of the only players in the field, at least competitive players, right? Him, Brian Harman, I mean, Phil, he's not really competitive at this point, that's going to be out there. And maybe there's an advantage for the guys that are lefties and are hitting these fades, right? Like a lot of those players do. It'll be really hard to tell. You know, obviously, time will have to tell on that. But if you think about it, if you're a lefty, the whole back nine, you have OB down the right, right? So if you're a lefty that can hit a fade, you can fade it away from OB, right? If you're somebody who's a fader of the golf ball on a righty, like a Dustin Johnson, a lot of the top-end players tend to hit a fade. There are some that hit draws, but a majority of them hit fades. They have that bowed wrist and whatnot. Jordan Spieth, Dustin Johnson, you know, Colin Morikawa are ones that come to mind. They're going to be hitting towards the OB. So if you have these fade players that are these power players, the reason why they're power players is because they hold that bowed wrist out. McIntyre is playing away from the OB. I mean, even Phil Mickelson playing away from the OB, that's good when you're in crunch time, right? You don't want to have to change your ball flight to try and hit it away from the OB when you're in crunch time. Those guys that are used to hitting fades are probably going to try and hit the straight ball or perhaps even hit a draw, might overhook it or might end up slicing it, something like that, right? So I know it's a small little edge here, but you're talking about 3.2% owned Robert McIntyre. Definitely something that I'll be investing in quite a few lineups, like 15 to 20%. That's what I mean by quite a few. And lastly, guys, the big cat. I think he's being disrespected, 4.2% owned. And now I haven't played him to this point in DFS. I took him at the PGA in like 5 lineups as just a pure comedy type thing. But this week it's a legitimate play. This golf course is flat. I fully expect him to, at the very least, finish this golf tournament, maybe over the weekend. He's starting to get a little bit of a limp. I would expect that, right? Playing 18 holes for 4 straight days will get to anybody, let alone somebody with the conditions that he has. But if you're looking for a great approach player, right? He checks that box. The best iron player of all time. Creativity, the most creative player of all time. He's won here twice. That speaks for itself. I think even a 50% Tiger Woods is more than capable of finishing in the top 10 here. And if he's, you know, been any sort of truthful to us at this point of the week, you know, he hasn't been out there just BSing us in some of his interviews. He sounds like he's a lot closer to 80% than he is 50%. And an 80% Tiger Woods, I think, has a legitimately good chance to finish top 10 here, because this golf course is all about strategy. You've heard multiple players this week talk about how power is not even a thing here. You're getting at least 40 to 50 yards of extra rollout. It's why guys like a Robert McIntyre aren't going to have to hit driver off the tee, which I think might help them, right? It's why guys up top like a Jon Rahm aren't going to be able to gain a ton of strokes off the tee. Everyone's going to be hitting the ball far this week. Xander Schauffele, for example, he's been gaining a ton off the tee. He's not going to be able to leverage that sort of thing. It's going to be all about the approach play, which Will Zalatoris, right? One of the best approach players in the world. Brooks Koepka can be one of the best approach players in the world. Tiger Woods, when he's on his game, is unbelievably good at shaping shots. I mean, he's just hitting stingers out there. I think the big cat finishes top 10 this week. I've placed a bet on it. I've placed a bet on him, a huge bet on him to make the cut this week. But even in DFS, guys, $7,500. If he finishes T11, that's probably enough to pay off in a large field GBP. And that's all we're looking for here, right? It's not like he's $8,500. It's not like he's 10, 15% owned. You're looking at 4.2%. Maybe in the larger field contests, you know, Millie Maker, that type of thing, he's closer to like 7-8% because a lot of the casuals want to play some Tiger Woods just for the heck of it. But I think from an actual play standpoint, it's not the worst idea, right? I mean, you're talking about this is a golf course that's hard to cap. It's hard to look at stats for St. Andrews. I mean, you've heard that multiple times this week, I'm really sure. Tiger Woods, you know, the stats aren't going to look good on him, but if we're, you know, kind of pushing those aside and just thinking about narrative, he's the exact type of player we're looking for. And obviously the health is the biggest concern there. But if I'm taking 15, maybe 20% if I'm feeling really frisky about it this week of Tiger Woods, it's not going to end my week if he withdraws after the second round. It really isn't. It would suck, right? There'd be like a couple $100 out of my 150 max. I'm not going to play him in my single entry, anything in the high dollar stuff, that sort of thing. It would suck, but it'd be worth it, right? Because if he goes out there and finishes top 10 and he's 4.2% owned, he could be the keys to winning a GPP this week. Alrighty, guys, that's all I've got for the DFS fades and sleepers. Tonight, we will have a live stream at 7 p.m. Eastern time, so make sure to stop on by with any questions you have. We'll talk about the weather, any last-second changes to my player pool, and of course, make sure you comment down below who you're fading this week and who your biggest sleeper pick is, and make sure you smash that like button before you get out of here. I appreciate all the support, guys. Best of luck with all of your lineups here for what's going to be one of my favorite events this year. You know, typically the Open, maybe not my favorite major championship, but when it's at St. Andrews and the Old Course, it's hard to beat that. I mean, even a little bit more excited than I was for the Masters even at this point. So really looking forward to it, guys. Make sure you wake up bright and early just in case there's any withdrawals. And again, best of luck.